Okay, so we're going to plow on through chapter 17. I'm going to continue to use the book slides today, and I'm hoping to get through the rest of them. And then on Thursday, I'm going to do a couple of exercises to practice using a couple of techniques in Excel to show you how to do those. So we will, let's just go ahead and plow on here. Okay, so we left off talking about current ratio and days cash on hand. We had previously talked about current ratio, and so so we spent more time talking about days cash on hand, the importance of having enough cash on hand. This is absolutely one of the critical numbers that that hospital leadership in particular pays attention to, but every organization has to pay attention to. Managing cash is absolutely a critical function. All right, so next, again, we now move from kind of short-term management to a little longer-term management and talking about the debt ratio and the times interest earned ratio. So the debt ratio we covered in chapter 4. It looks at the overall financing of the organization. So this is getting into the capital structure of the organization, and it asks how much of the organization is financed by liabilities or debt, right? So liabilities and debt, same general idea. Debt. And so basically this nominal organization we're working with is 29% financed by debt, which means, and this is one of those ratios where there's a flip side of it, and the flip side is if it's 29% debt, then it has to be 71% equity, right? Because the capital structure has to add up to 100%. And so if they're 29% debt, then whatever's left of the 100% has to be equity. So we're looking here total debt, and there are some other ratios that look more at specifically at, say, long-term debt. Let me get rid of that. So in this case, debt ratio, that's one you guys already know. So I'm not going to spend any more time on that. Times interest earned ratio. Okay, so this uses a new acronym called Ebit that we haven't really talked about in this class. Ebit stands for, and you have it written out down here, earnings before interest and taxes, which is kind of like operating income. So, and this is a very common term used, particularly. We don't use it as much in this class because it's a term that's more often used in the for-profit sector. And mostly it's because, 60% more, maybe more than 60% of hospitals are not-for-profits, right? And so we tend to be dominated by, the healthcare sector is dominated by nonprofit entities, even though, say, all physician practices are almost, that's not true. Most physician practices are for-profit, though I can think of several exceptions. Core Physicians here in or down in Exeter is a not-for-profit entity. I believe Wentworth Partners is also a not-for-profit entity. So there are physician organizations that are not-for-profit. So there's a lot. So anyway, the reason we don't talk about Ebit all that much in healthcare is because of the tax component that we just, for the most part, we kind of ignore in the not-for-profit sector because our entities don't pay taxes. But basically, Ebit, if you want to kind of, when you hear Ebit, you ought to think, okay, that's kind of like operating income. Okay, so we're going to take Ebit, which is the earnings before interest and taxes, which basically means that we take net income and we add back the taxes if the entity pays taxes, and we add back the interest payments. Because what we're trying to figure out with the times interest earned ratio is how fragile is the organization with respect to its debt financing, right? So the question really that you're trying to answer with this ratio is the organization earning enough income, right? Not revenue, but income, right? Income being revenue minus expenses. So is there enough money left over after we pay all our operating expenses to pay our interest payments? And so you want to have plenty of room to pay your interest payments because, as we've discussed, this is dangerous, right? Interest payments are dangerous because the bank wants to be paid regardless of how well your operations are going. Okay, so this is an important one in that sense because it measures how risky is this organization from a financing perspective. Is it risky because of the way of its capital structure, which we get from up here, right? So all these things tend to interact in different ways. It's a little bit like driving your car. Like imagine if you're driving your car and you've got all these gauges on your dashboard, right? You've got your speedometer, you've got your odometer, you've got your gas gauge, you've got your RPMs, right? Each of those dials tells you something different about what's going on with your car. If all you had was your speedometer, right, and you're driving around having a good time, and you don't have your gas gauge, for example, sooner or later you're going to run out of gas and you're going to be stuck on the side of the road. So you might not get a ticket for speeding, right, but you're going to run out of gas and be stuck on the side of the road. If you don't have, they all tell you something different, like your engine temperature, light. 99.99% of the time when you're driving around and your engine temperature light doesn't tell you anything, but when it needs to tell you something, you need to be able to pick up on it, right? And so it's that's one of those urgent ones. So the point here is all these ratios are like the gauges on a dashboard that you're driving a car with. You want to be able to. They're all important. Some are more important on a day-to-day basis than others, like days cash on hand is probably more important than say the debt ratio on a day-to-day basis, but they all tell you something about the health of the organization. So times interest earned tells you a bit about the fragility of the organization. How sensitive is this organization going to be to changes in its earnings? Because if this ratio is low, then a bad year might make this organization go into bankruptcy. Because if you can't pay your interest payments, you wind up going into bankruptcy. Sorry, my dog wants to come visit. Dog has to come in and check on how things are going. All right, so let's talk. So that's an important one. It focuses on both of these. Debt ratio focuses on capital structure. Times interest earned kind of brings together capital structure and operating information, right? Which is kind of interesting and something that you start wanting to pay attention to. Okay, so now we kind of look at the flow for this particular organization. Again, we're looking at the organization compared to itself over time, as well as the industry standard. So this organization has a relatively low debt ratio, and then they have a relatively high times interest earned ratio, except for that 1 year here where they had a bad year, which we've kind of been talking about. So having all things considered, you want to have a low debt ratio and a high, or all things constant, you'd rather have a low debt ratio and a high times interest earned. Now, the point I've made in the past that I want you to hold in your head is it's kind of within a range, right? You want that lower debt ratio and that higher times interest earned. But if the industry average is 43% and you're 29%. What does that mean? Well, it's good in the sense that you're less sensitive, your organization is less sensitive to fluctuations in your earnings because you are mostly equity funded. But it also means you haven't used as much financial leverage as your competitors, right, to expand the ability of your organization to provide care. So this organization has a low debt ratio. That's good on the one hand because it makes them less sensitive to fluctuations in their earnings. But on the flip side of that, their organization doesn't have as many resources because they have not used as much debt as they could potentially use. And so that means that their organization is not as big, it's not providing as much care as it could potentially provide because they are being conservative. So there's an argument here to say maybe that organization should take on more debt, expand its services more, right? And so that, just looking at the debt ratio, you could make that argument. On the one hand, conservative, and that's good. And being conservative is good in the sense that the organization is less likely to fail. But being conservative is while it's good in that sense, it's bad in the sense that they're not providing as much care as they could potentially provide. Okay, so that's the kind of two ways to look at this same ratio. All right. Now we're going to move from debt management, which is focused again on capital structure and kind of financial fragility, and we'll talk about asset management. So asset management ratios are really trying to say, how efficient is this organization? And so we've got two asset management numbers that are used by organizations. The first one fixed asset turnover, takes all of the revenues that the organization earns and divides it by net fixed assets. So net fixed assets is net property, plant, and equipment, right? At least that's the way we've framed it. So, so what we're doing is we're dividing all the revenues that the organization brings in by the amount of physical stuff that the organization has. And so the idea here is us as the board of Wentworth Douglas are saying to the CEO, we have given you this stuff. We've given you this cool building. We've given you all this equipment. We've given you these vehicles. And so on and so forth. Remember, net fixed net property, plant, and equipment is your long-term stuff. It is leaving out all the inventory, all the drugs, all the stuff that we're going to use on a day-to-day basis. That's left out. What's here is the assets that have a long life, right? Something everything is going to last more than a year here. So we're saying, how efficient are you, given all the stuff we've given you? Here's all these great toys. Management. What are you doing with our toys? Are you doing a good job earning revenues or not? And so the only difference between fixed asset and total asset turnover, it's really kind of the same idea. How much revenue are you earning for all the stuff that we, the board, have given you? The difference between fixed asset turnover and total asset turnover is, whereas fixed asset turnover focuses only on the long-lived physical assets, total asset turnover includes everything. So what goes into the denominator here on total asset turnover includes things like the pharmaceuticals in the pharmacy, right? The inventory, all the syringes, all the medications, all the bandages, as well as the physical buildings, the physical, the equipment and all that stuff, right? And cash, right? Everything goes into the denominator for total asset turnover. So they're both asking the same question, how well are you, management, doing at generating revenue with the stuff we have given you, but with fixed asset turnover, the stuff is more narrowly defined. And then with total asset turnover, it's just everything. And they both tell you a slightly different story. But and it just kind of depends on depending on your organization, which one of these is more appropriate, more important to look at. So let's see here.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah, Caitlin, sure.
Are the denominators for like all the total assets, is that just for that year, or is it like the historical price of like a building?
Okay, so the historical price of the building is going to be the gross fixed assets, right? And then you're going to subtract depreciation, and that will get you to net fixed assets, and that shows up in either account, right? So that when you go to total assets, the accumulated depreciation has been subtracted off as well.
Okay.
But they are snapshots in time. So in this case, we're combining data from, in both of these, we're combining data from the income statement in the numerator, and data from, and assets are obviously coming from the balance sheet. So the balance sheet, as we know, is a snapshot in time in the sense of like, on this date, how much assets did we have? Whereas the total revenue is how much revenue do we earn over a period of time. And we typically take it at the end, at the end of a particular period. So at the end of fiscal year 2019, we had this much assets, and over the fiscal year 19, we earned this much revenue. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the third ratio that we want to talk about here is, and this is a really important one that is followed by every organization. So like days cash on hand, this is a hot one too, which is days in patient accounts receivable. Or I don't usually see it as DIPAR. I usually see it as just days in like people say it as days in AR. Days in accounts receivable. So you probably won't hear it as said as days in patient accounts receivable. You'll probably hear it days accounts receivable, or days in accounts receivable, whatever. What that is the idea that how well are we managing our accounts receivable account. So remember, we're a accrual-based organization. In healthcare, we're typically accrual-based. So whether we're a physician practice or a hospital, right, or some other related entity, we typically see patients, we bill them, and then we collect the cash from insurance companies later, 30, 45 days later. And so what this ratio tells us is how many days in accounts receivable are we sitting at? Meaning, how much of our revenue is tied up in this kind of limbo where we're waiting to actually receive the cash? Because remember, days cash on hand is really, really, really important because we have to really, really pay our bills in cash. So if we've got all this revenue that we've been booking, but we haven't collected the cash that goes with the revenue, then we might not be able to pay our bills. And so organizations want to manage the days accounts receivable down as low as possible. So this is one of those ones where it isn't a range, right? The goal is get this number as low as possible. End of discussion. There is no kind of, we want, now it's unrealistic to get it to zero, right? Because that's like impossible, but we want to get it as low as possible, 20, 30 days, right? As opposed to 73 days or 64 days. Seems that's a high number. I don't think that's right as an industry standard. But the goal is we want to get it low, right? And so what we're taking is the accounts receivable that's off of our balance sheet in the current asset section, and we're dividing it by the amount of revenue we earn per day, which is what this is, NPSR. So if you take our annual NPSR divided by 365, that gives us the amount of money, the amount of the amount of revenue that we bring in each day. And so we take the total amount of accounts receivable that we're sitting with, and we divide it by the number of the revenue per day. That gives us an approximate amount of revenue of days of revenue that are sitting unpaid, right? And so that's why we want to drive that number down. So this organization is a little high relative to the industry standard. So again, we're going to look at everything in terms of an industry standard and then comparing ourselves to ourselves. So here, the organization has a very low fixed asset turnover, a relatively low total asset turnover. So what does that tell us? Well, that tells us that our management's not doing a great job in terms of generating revenue with respect to the resources that it's been given, right? Both of FATO and TATO, right? Fixed asset turnover and total asset turnover, we want those numbers to be high, right? A good management takes very little resources and generates lots of money. So that's what a high FATO, a high TATO would tell us is the management is taking very little and making a lot. In this case, this organization is taking a lot and making relatively little, right? So that's not a particularly good indicator. You don't want to be that manager. Days in accounts receivable, the organization is a little high. So in this case, again, days in patient accounts receivable, you want that number to be as low as possible. So really all three of these are kind of unlimited in terms of how high or low you want them. But you really want the top two to be high and the last one to be as low as possible. All right. So we're going to talk Dupont analysis here next. And there's a bunch of problems in the book about this. I like Dupont analysis. I think it's kind of cool. And I think you should think so too, as a geeky finance person, right? So this is really, it's really four ratios. It is ROE, which is a ratio, right, expressed as three related ratios. And you could just get ROE, right? You could just calculate ROE. But what these three ratios combine together to generate ROE. Now you could just get ROE all on your own, right? So it's not like I need these three ratios to give me ROE. The point is to decompose ROE into three related ratios to tell you where's ROE coming from. So let's look at the three ratios. So the three ratios, so remember ROE is return on equity. So that's net income divided by equity. So the equity, remember, is the amount, the portion of the organization that is financed, right? So equity is there's the equity and there's the liabilities section of the balance sheet. Equity is the portion of the organization that's owned by the investors. So what we said, ROE, investors really care about ROE. And when we talk nonprofit, the board is standing in as the interests of the community, which are nominally the owners or investors in the organization. So remember, Wentworth Douglas is owned by the community of, the Seacoast community, right? And so the equity in the organization is the portion of the organization that's financed by the Seacoast community. The liabilities portion of the organization is the portion of the organization that's financed by debt. So we can look at these three, if we multiply them together, come out to ROE, because ROE is, I'm going to change this. There we go. ROE really is net income. No. Change this one. All right, I can't get it. What am I? No. It was almost there. Net income. Remember, ROE is net income divided by total equity. So TE, total equity. So we have total margin, right, is profit margin. So that's an important. All three of these are important numbers, right? Total margin is profit margin. We want profit margin to be higher. What does profit margin tell us? One way to look at profit margin is an expense control measure, right? So it is a ratio that tells us how effective is management at controlling expenses, because the difference between net income and revenue is expenses, because net income is simply revenue minus expenses if in aggregate. So if you hold revenue constant and you do a better job of controlling expenses, then your total margin is going to go up because net income will go up, right? If we hold the denominator constant and we improve the numerator, then the overall ratio will go up, right? And so this total margin you can look at as an expense control metric, right? It measures how effective is the organization at controlling expenses. Because if we're comparing this ratio to other organizations' total margins, we don't care about so much about the actual, absolute numbers in the numerator and the denominator. What we care about is the ratio itself. And so holding revenue constant, net income is going to be higher if you do better at controlling your expenses. So this, you can think of total margin as the management's contribution to ROE by controlling expenses. The next thing is total asset turnover, and this is an asset management metric. So this asks how effective is management at utilizing the resources that it's been given, right? If you're familiar with the parable of the talents from the Bible, it's one of my favorite Bible stories. It talks about the wealthy master who leaves 10 bags of gold to one person and 5 bags to another and 1 bag to another, right? And the guy with the 10 bags turns it into 100 bags of gold, right? And then the 5 bags person turns it into 10 bags, and the 1 bag person hides it in the backyard and doesn't do anything with it. And the 10 bag guy winds up being given the 1 bag, and the 1 bag guy gets sent out, gets fired. It's kind of the story here, right? We want our, we're going to give you, hey manager, we're giving you these assets, right? We're giving you all these assets. How have you done at generating revenue with the assets we've given you? And we want you to show us that number's big. Right? We want we want total margin to be big, and we want it to be big by you doing a good job controlling expenses. We want total asset turnover to be big by you doing a good job earning revenue with the resources we have given you. And so holding resources constant, if you generate more revenue with the same amount of resources, you're a better manager, right? So we want both of these to be big. Equity multiplier, we didn't talk about, but is kind of the flip side of debt, the debt ratio, right? This is asking this is a capital structure question, right? Remember, total assets is made up of total equity plus total liabilities. So if we had total assets in the numerator and total equity, and then we added total liabilities into the denominator. We don't, but if we did, we'd have 1/1, right? It'd be 100, because total equity plus total liabilities here would be the same thing as total assets. They have to add up because the two sides of the balance sheet have to add up, right? So really what this one does is it focuses on equity, the equity portion of the financing of the organization, as opposed to the debt ratio focuses on the debt financing of the organization. But it really is a measure of how your organization is financed. So the difference between total assets and total equity is total liabilities. So the higher this number is, the more debt you are taking out, right? So an organization with a very high debt ratio is going to have a very high equity multiplier. Why? Because if you have a high debt ratio, you have a very small equity number. So in this case, this organization had, what did we say, 29% debt ratio, which means they're 71% equity financed. So if we put 1 in the numerator for 100% assets, we would put 0.71 in the denominator for this organization, which, make me a liar here, divided by 0.71 gives us 1.4, which would be this one right here, 1.41, right? So if I took 1 in the numerator to represent 100% of the assets and 0.71, which is 71% financed by debt, you wind up getting that 1.41. Now that's just using ratios. We could go back to the balance sheet, 22, and looking at, wrong one, total net assets of 107 divided by, or rather 151 in total assets divided by 107 in net assets would give us that 1.41 number as well. So a higher number here means that the organization is more financially leveraged, meaning that the higher that number is, the more risk management is taking. It's a really important point. Okay, the higher this number is, the more financial leverage the organization is taking on, meaning it's more financed by debt, because the way that the denominator gets smaller is by increasing the amount of debt, because the denominator can't be bigger than the numerator. The numerator is 100%. So an organization with zero debt financing would have total assets divided by total equity, and the two of them would be equal. If I had an organization with $100 in assets and I was 100% equity financed, I would also have $100 in equity. For every dollar I take out in debt, that my equity gets smaller. So if I took out $20 in 20% equity, $20 in equity, I would have $100 in assets, $80 in total equity. This organization has 29% debt ratio. So that means we'd have $100 in assets and $71 in equity, right? So the bigger that number is, the more financial risk the organization is taking on. So these two numbers you want big, right? These two numbers, the bigger these two numbers are, the better the organization is doing. The bigger this number is, the more risk this organization is taking on. So ROE can get big, right? ROE, if you've got a big ROE number, it gets big by having good expense control. It gets big holding everything else constant. It gets big by management doing a good job generating revenue with respect to the assets that it's been given. Or holding everything else constant, it gets big by management leveraging up the organization and taking on lots of financial risk. The first two are good. The third one is dangerous, right? So some organizations, and I'll show you an example of that next time, but I'll tell you, kind of give you the punchline away. Catholic Medical Center, I'll compare them to Exeter Hospital. Catholic Medical Center had a higher ROE than Exeter Hospital in the years that I've got data for. But Catholic Medical Center is hugely financially leveraged. They've got a ton of debt. Just a ton of debt, whereas Exeter is fairly conservative and has very little debt. So when you control for the amount of debt that Catholic Medical Center had taken on, their ROE falls back down to right about where Exeter was. Okay, so ROE is kind of like the ultimate measure of financial success from an investor's perspective, but there are multiple ways to get to a higher ROE. You can do a good job controlling expenses, you can do a good job generating revenue with respect to your assets, or you can bulk up on debt. And all three of them will get you a high ROE, but these are the two that get you high quality ROE, meaning these are the total margin and the total asset turnover. That's where you want to earn your ROE. Total equity multiplier, having a high equity multiplier will also give you a high ROE, but that's like, taking stimulants before sniffing a bunch of cocaine before you run a road race, right? Yeah, you'll go past everybody else, and then you'll have a heart attack at the end of the race and die. So that's kind of that's the unhealthy way to generate high ROE. So think about that as think about equity multipliers like taking stimulants, right? Yep, you'll run faster than everybody else. As sooner or later, everything is going to come crashing down, right? So, all right. So that's a cool, DuPont ratio, there's a bunch of problems in the book dealing with that, and it makes you think about the different ways. And I think it's a nice, very simplistic way of looking at an organization. Okay, so we're going to do common size analysis and percent change analysis next time. So I'm going to skip over that for now. So now we're going to talk, we've been talking about financial indicators. Organizations also follow operating indicators, which are a blend of finance and operations. So we've got some different ones, a variety of different categories. So let's talk about a few. Profit per discharge. So here's where we're going to be trying to measure the efficiency of the organization. Are we doing a good job controlling costs and earning profit, right? Because profit is revenue minus expenses. We tend not to have much control over how much revenue we earn per discharge because that's a negotiated price, or that might be a price that's just handed to us by Medicare saying, for this type of patient, right? We pay you this much money. Okay, well, if we've got a fixed revenue amount coming in per discharge, then what we're really doing is controlling expenses. So in a way, this is, again, a cost control measure. So if we have total profits, so this is a discharge, so it has to be inpatient, right? Because we don't discharge outpatient patients. We have visits with outpatient patients. We have discharges are only for inpatient. So we'd have to be able to divide our revenue streams into outpatient revenues and inpatient revenues. Our inpatient revenues are based on discharges. So we divide the amount of profit we earn from inpatient discharges, so the amount of profit we earn from inpatient discharges divided by total discharges to give us a dollar per discharge. So again, to interpret that, you're looking at cost control probably primarily. Net price per discharge, instead of looking at profit, you're looking at revenues, right? You're not going to have, and this would be net inpatient revenue, right? That's going to be net of contractual allowances. This one's not a particularly important one. Occupancy rate is a really important one, and it is one of the ones that you as a senior leader someday, if you're running a hospital, you're going to look at this every day. Right? And what you're asking really on a daily basis is I've got 100 beds, how many beds have heads in them, right? Heads and beds. So I've got this really expensive resource, an inpatient bed. Do I have a patient in that bed? And we measure this, well, here it's being measured as licensed beds, but we actually care less about licensed beds and more about staffed beds. So we might be licensed for 400 beds, but we only staff to 250 beds. So we really care. I'm just telling you reality, right? So the book slides, because I'm borrowing the book slides, focused on licensed beds, but like Catholic Medical Center, I think, is licensed for like 400 beds. They only staff 250, something like that, right? And so there's a real cost to having a licensed bed, in the sense that you have to have the physical space dedicated to this, but but on a daily basis, a staffed bed means you have a bed, so you have the physical space that you've invested in, you have the equipment, but you also have a nurse who is being paid to be there. And if you have a staffed bed and no head in the bed and no patient in the bed, you have a cost. In addition to the kind of the big cost, of the physical assets, you also have a variable cost in terms of paying nursing staff to be on hand, and they're not taking care of any patients. So you really want to have in either of these, you want a high number, right? And so if you're measuring it by licensed beds, it is okay to have a lower number, because your maximum number of beds is going to be your number of licensed beds. But what you really care about is your staffed beds, right? Because those staffed beds, you're spending money on each one of them every day, whereas licensed beds, you're kind of dealing with like a depreciation expense. But either way, higher is better, right? So we want to have, if we've got an asset like beds, you want to fill those assets, because if you're not filling them, you have a fixed cost and no revenue coming in. All right. Length of stay is also a really important measure. You will also see it framed as ALOS, average length of stay, which is how it's written here. So you'll see it as LOS or ALOS. They both mean the same thing, but you're going to hear this. This is another one that's talked about constantly. And it's a really important one for, say, a critical access hospital. A critical access hospital isn't allowed to have a length of stay, by law, isn't allowed to have a length of stay greater than 3 days, because the idea of a critical access hospital is it's there to take care of low acuity, meaning relatively healthy patients. And patients who have serious illnesses are supposed to be referred to higher acuity hospitals. So if you're Androscoggin Valley Hospital up in Berlin, New Hampshire, you are a critical access hospital. So you guys, some of you have met Mike Peterson. He is the CEO up there, he's a friend of mine. That's a critical access hospital. He has to keep his length of stay below 3 days, or he can't be a critical access hospital. So whenever he gets a seriously ill patient who's going to have to be hospitalized for more than 3 days, his nursing staff, his senior nurse and medical staff are discussing, should we be sending this person over to Dartmouth-Hitchcock or one of the other larger hospitals to get their care, so that we can keep our length of stay below 3 days. So length of stay is simply, it's a pretty simple number. It is your total number of patient days divided by your total discharges. So if I have an average length of stay, right, of 3 days per patient, I can multiply that by the number of discharges or the number of patients, and it gives me my total number of inpatient days. So I can kind of manipulate this around. So if I have a 5.2 average length of stay, and I multiply it by 18,000 discharges, I get the number of patient days that I have. So if I have one patient stay for 3 days, that's 3 inpatient days, and I have another, and they add all those up to my inpatient days. So the industry average 4.7, they have 5.2, so it's a little long. Now, why do we care about length of stay? Aside from the fact, if let's say we're not a critical access hospital and we're not worried about losing our standing as a critical access hospital, why do we care about length of stay? Well, the answer is most hospitals are paid per discharge, right? So if you come in with a DRG, right, a diagnostic related group, a DRG, so you get labeled with a DRG based on your condition, you get admitted. The insurance company is going to pay a fixed amount of money based on your DRG, right? So whatever the physician admits you as having, for needing. So let's say it's a knee replacement, right? That's going to be a fixed dollar amount. It's going to be $30,000, right? And that's going to include the cost. It doesn't include the surgeon cost. It includes all the hospital's expenses. So that's the OR time, all the OR nurses, the supplies in the OR, right? And then it's your move from the OR, down to the orthopedics wing, right, where you're cared for by nursing staff there. You're using all these supplies to take care of your wound, feeding you, all that stuff, right? And the longer you stay, the more times you have to be fed, the more supplies are used on you, and so forth. That's ringing up a larger and larger cost. So if I can get you out of there in 2 days as opposed to 3 days, right, that additional day, if you stay an additional day, that's another day, first of all, that I can't put another patient in that bed because you're in that bed, so I can't turn the bed over. So it's kind of like, think about like those of you who work at restaurants, right? You want to turn the table over and get another table in so you can get more tips, right? Same with the hospital. They want to turn the beds over. But if you stay an extra day, unlike a restaurant, with a hospital, you keep on feeding them more money, more food. You keep on spending more on supplies, and you have more nursing costs for that same patient. So hospitals want to reduce the number of days length of stay per discharge because there's a real cost associated with longer lengths of stay, and you get the same payment, right? It's a fixed payment for the based on the DRG, but your costs are variable. So you have fixed revenues and variable costs. So you want to control your variable costs. So it's kind of like the capitated model, right? So length of stay is important because it gives us a good sense of expense control. So that's one way to look at it, is expense control. It's also healthier for the patient to get out sooner than later. But this is one of those within a range. Okay. Case mix indicator is a measure of acuity. And so this kind of measures, it doesn't kind of, it measures the intensity of care that your organization is doing. So a higher case mix says this organization takes care of sicker patients. A lower case mix says this organization takes care of lower acuity patients. So you would expect to see Dartmouth-Hitchcock have a higher case mix index than Androscoggin, which is a critical access hospital again. Okay. Here's another, this is a nursing, primarily a nursing metric. And it is looked at constantly as well. FTEs are, measuring FTEs and tracking FTEs is one of the most important things that the chief nurse does, because it's one of those, like, do we have a head in a bed? Okay, if we have a head in a bed, when we need a nurse, but if we don't have a head in a bed, we don't need a nurse, so we want to send nurses home, right? We have some fluidity in terms of some of our staff, right? We want some of our staff to be contingent, be able to bring it in to increase if we have a head in a bed and decrease if we don't. And so this is a kind of an overall measure of how effectively the organization is managing its staffing. So this is an expense, right? This is a measure of expense. The higher that FTE per bed is, the more expensive it is, because that means you have more nurses per bed, right? And so from a management perspective, you want to keep that number low. You'll hear this is a big conflict in healthcare, right? And so the nursing organizations are always pushing for higher nursing ratios, meaning higher FTE per bed ratios, but that's expensive. And so organizations are always trying to figure out, how can we keep that number low? And, and so there's a push and a pull. The nursing organizations, at least nominally, are arguing for that it's dangerous to have fewer nurses per patient, and that's true. There is truth to that. But the flip side of that is additional nurses are expensive, and we can't provide as much care if we have too many nurses, because we don't get enough revenue to pay for the nursing staff. So there's a back and forth, and you will see this forever in your experience in healthcare. But this is really a measure. This is again another expense measure. So from a hard-nosed management perspective, us mean hospital administrators want to keep this number as low as possible. All right, and then salary per FTE. This is a way of kind of figuring out how expensive is your staff. So one way to reduce, to increase FTEs, but decrease total salary would be you hire lower. Looking for the word. Less trained individuals. So you replace an RN, right, a registered nurse, a full credentialed nurse, with an LPN, a licensed practical nurse, or you replace an LPN with an LNA, right? And you get everybody to practice at the top of their license. So you try to have as few RNs as you can on the ward, and you bring in, LPNs or LNAs to do all the kind of the scut work. And so you don't have nurses changing bed sheets. You get an LNA to change a bed sheet, right? And so that way the nurses can do only what nurses can do, and you have the LNAs do all of the lower level work. So some of you guys are LNAs, so you probably know this, right? So who's going to, there's no need for an RN to deliver food, right? That can be done by an LNA. No reason for an RN to be changing beds. That can be done by an LNA, and so on, right? But who has to deliver medication? Well, either an LPN or an RN. Somebody has to evaluate the patient. That's got to be the RN. So let's get the RN to do the evaluations. Let's let the LPNs deliver medication, and let's let the LNAs do all the dirty work, right? Rather than having a very expensive $80,000, $90,000 asset, meaning the nurse, changing beds, when we can have somebody who doesn't have any training at all change beds, right? That isn't a medical skill, right? Any of us can change a bed. So the salary per FTE is a measure of how effective are you at having a mix of less expensive and more expensive employees working on your wards. All right. So we've talked about that. It's hard to say, any given, so this point I want to make, if you look at any one ratio by itself, it's not going to tell you the whole story. You're wanting like your, dashboard in your car, you're wanting to look at and kind of keep an eye on all of them because they all interact, right? So how many miles do I have to go drive to get to, visit my friend? Well, it's 100 miles. I'm looking at my odometer. How much gas do I have? Do I have enough gas to get there? Speedometer. I'm looking at how fast am I driving so I don't get a ticket. I want to get there as fast as I can, but not so fast that I get a ticket. Not so, and I don't want to drive too slow because then I'm wasting my time. I want my, all the gauges have to go together. So any one can't really tell you whether an organization is effective. You really want to see the whole picture. So benchmarking, we've been talking about this, comparing organizations to benchmarks. And so you want to look at where your organization falls in with respect to the rest of the organization. So I think our nominal case was Riverside. And so we're comparing Riverside total margin to several competitors as well as industry averages. So you typically look at quartiles, right? So you have the top 25%, right, is 88.4 and above. The industry median, all right. The industry median, right, meaning the middle, as opposed to the mean, the middle is 5, and then the lower quartile, meaning the bottom 25% of the organizations make 1.8%. So the median is 5, Riverside's making 7.3. So you'd be able to say, well, that's good, right? 7.3 is good. In 2014, however, Riverside earned 2.2, which was below the industry median of 4.7. So we can get this data. You can get this data from the American Hospital Association, from MGMA. So if you're looking at hospitals, you go to the Hospital Association. If you're looking at clinical, so physician practices, you'd go to the Medical Group Management Association. And then there are other associations for, there's long-term care associations and so forth that have these averages so that you can benchmark your organization against the averages. So if you're ever in a position to be in a leadership role, or if you're ever on a board, that's what you're going to want to ask is, okay, 7.3%. Sounds good. Is it good? How do you know? Well, you know by comparing it to some sort of benchmark, in particular the industry median. But you also might want to, if you're looking at the industry, like the whole country, that's one thing. But you also want to look at your regional competition, because maybe if Riverside was here on the seacoast, right, if it was on the, the Oyster River, Riverside, right, and it was making 7.3%, and we'd said, well, the national average is 5.0. But what if every other hospital in the area around us is making 7.5%? So what if Riverside is here in Durham and Wentworth Douglas is making 8% and Exeter is making 8.2% and Portsmouth's making 8.7%? Is 7.3% still good? Maybe not, right? So it's everything is relative, right? And it's important to think about what you are benchmarking against. Are you using the appropriate benchmark? So you definitely want to use, so if you're a community hospital like Exeter or Wentworth Douglas, you want to compare yourself to other community hospitals. You don't want to compare your ratios. If you're Wentworth Douglas, you don't want to compare your ratios to Mass General. And that's an apples and oranges comparison. Even though they're both hospitals, that's a meaningless comparison. So when you use so that's another point, when you use an overall industry average, that's going to roll up all your critical access hospitals, your community hospitals, as well as your academic medical centers. So you have these, giant hospitals, these kind of medium hospitals, and these itty bitty hospitals, and they're all rolled up together to come up with an industry average. So if you're running Dartmouth Hitchcock, you don't want to compare yourself to Wentworth Douglas. And you certainly don't want to compare yourself to Androscoggin, right, which is, a 10th your size. So again, finding the right benchmarks are important. And so that's something that you as a future leader are going to have to think about is, what's my benchmark? And when I'm evaluating my performance, who am I comparing my performance to? Okay. So you will hear this phrase KPIs, and what that just means is key performance indicators. And that typically means, when you hear KPI, what that typically means is we're doing some sort of ratio analysis. We're doing some sort of benchmarking where we're looking at how our results are against other organizations, or some other, some sort of benchmark. So the key performance indicator is, we're not going to be paying attention to all of the ratios because there's a bazillion of them. We're going to pick a dashboard of 10 or 12, that are the most important ones to pay attention to. And those are the ones we're going to report on month after month. Okay, so let's see. All right, so that's it for that chapter. Let me see if I can. So, any questions about that? What we've done so far. Okay, so for the test, I am going to give you, a variety of these kinds of questions. Some of them out of the, similar to the book, but I will also most likely give you some financial statements, and I will say, calculate these ratios, tell me what they tell you about the organization. So you're going to need to be able to, find the appropriate components and build up the ratios. We'll do some of that next time. I'm going to show you how to do, next time I'm going to show you how to do percent change comparisons, as well as common sized statements for both the income statement and balance sheet. Yeah, and so I'm going to be asking you to interpret. I may give you, two balance sheets and ask you to compare two hospitals, use some set of ratios, and I will probably ask you to do something like that on the exam to tell me how are the organizations doing relative to each other. Yeah, okay. So I think we'll stop a little early today, and because I haven't prepped to show you the common sized, but I will be sending out a spreadsheet that we'll work together on next time for next class. So watch for that. Any questions?